My name is Sunday, and for as long as I can remember, I have been fascinated by the world around me in a way that seems to have confused my family. My sister Emma, sparkling with blonde curls and laughing like a little fairy, played with dolls, built castles in the air, portrayed a princess being rescued by a prince on a white horse. From an early age, she confidently and, it seemed, almost rightfully considered herself the center of our family universe, and I always found comfort not in the beauty of silk dresses or toy carriages, but in those small treasures that nature generously scattered under my feet. From an early age, my pockets were full of all sorts of strange finds, smooth as marble, river pebbles, bright red and scarlet autumn leaves, small flowers with fancy patterns of petals. I put all this under my bed or carefully stored it in an old box from my mother's cereal. One day, my mother gave me a small magnifying glass that came with breakfast as a souvenir. Then a new world began for me. Now I could look at every vein on the leaf, every dot on the beetle's wing with indescribable detail. I was amazed why the leaves change color and fall off, and with this question I went to my mother, holding a particularly bright maple leaf in my hands. But her answer was always the same: ask your teacher, Sunday. I'm busy right now helping Emma with her dance costume. Her eyes slid over me with gentle reproach, and I, a little ashamed of my questions, returned to my observations. One day, when I was 7 years old, I was sitting at the kitchen table, engrossed in an experiment that seemed so important to me, as if I were on the verge of a scientific discovery. Various liquids were spread out in front of me, and I carefully mixed them with baking soda, mesmerized by the reaction, the bubbling, the bubbles playing in the light. "What the hell are you doing, Sunday?" my mother's voice rang out, interrupting my concentration. I was startled to see her furrowed brows. "Look at this mess. Put it away right now. Your sister's friends are coming to a birthday party, and I need a kitchen." There was that irritated tone in her voice that I had already learned to accept as familiar. Emma's parties have always turned into grandiose events with lots of artists, elegant guests, and life-size cartoon characters. My birthdays were modest and quiet. Only Grandma and Grandpa came to them, who brought a homemade cake with green roses and silver beads. They seemed to be my only source of unconditional love, a real refuge from the constant reminder that I was a shadow, a slightly forgotten and not quite understandable addition to the world of my bright sister. My father, however, handed me another volume of the scientific encyclopedia once a year. "Here's your present, dear," he said, touching my shoulder with unflappable warmth. I loved these books. I adored their pages filled with illustrations, formulas, detailed descriptions of all kinds of phenomena. But every time I looked at the pile of toys and bright, buzzing parties that were arranged for Emma, I realized that my quiet gifts could not compare with the attention that invariably surrounded her. Grandma and Grandpa were my salvation. Every weekend and on vacation, they greeted me in their cozy home with joy, which warmed me, and sincere interest. Emma never went to my grandparents with me. They seemed to her extremely boring, devoid of those sparks and delights that, in her opinion, should accompany the weekend. "They're so boring," she sighed, dismissing my attempt to tell how my grandfather taught me to distinguish bird species by their singing. "Besides, Mom and Dad are taking me to the new theme park this weekend," she added with a smug smile, making it clear that her interests lay far beyond her grandparents' cozy little house, which still smelled of old books and chocolate brownies that Grandma baked especially for me. I watched from the window as my parents' car took Emma away to her world of bright lights and exciting entertainment, and tried to ignore the pain in my chest. "Why can't I come with you?" One day I couldn't stand it, approaching my mother with a timid question, in which, as it seemed to me, all my childhood sadness trembled. "Oh, dear," my mother replied with absent-minded tenderness, stroking my head as if I were something cute but somewhat inappropriate. "You're not going to like this." You probably just want to learn the mechanics of rides instead of having fun." She smiled, but it seemed a little tired, and I realized that her thoughts were already far away from here, somewhere out there, among the screams of fun and colorful balloons, where a carousel was circling to Emma's joyful screams. So that's how it was. Emma was a normal daughter, one who fit exactly into the framework of their ideas of what a girl should be. But I was a stranger to this picture, a child who asked too many questions, who preferred a microscope to makeup, who was brought happiness by found pebbles, rather than shiny jewelry and outfits. Countless questions about nature rang in my head, and I could spend the whole day watching an ant dragging a leaf many times larger than itself into its tiny kingdom. Everything changed when I started high school. There I met Mrs. Peterson, a science teacher, who, as it turned out, was the first adult after my grandparents to be able to see me for who I am. With her light hand, my questions no longer seemed stupid, and my observations were strange. To Mrs. Peterson, I was a little researcher, and her interest was sincere, genuine. One day, at a parent-teacher meeting, I heard her voice sounding with unusual firmness. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker, your daughter has extraordinary potential," she told my parents, leaving them no chance to ignore her words. I've never seen students grasp complex scientific concepts as quickly as Sunday does. We need to discuss her transfer to our program for gifted children. I was sitting on a bench near the office and listening to this conversation with a sinking heart. Mom's voice, however, sounded with that dismissive tone that I was all too familiar with. "A program for gifted children," she repeated with displeasure, as if even the very name was unpleasant to her. "It sounds pretty complicated." "She's doing well where she is." Dad, as usual, remained silent, and, as I already knew, this meant their unspoken no. Of course they will say no. They always said no when it came to me. But the next day, Grandma found out about it. She entered the school like a general confidently marching to war, and went straight to the principal's office. I will never forget how she stood there, proud and unbending, her voice flowing like icy water, leaving no room for objections. "My granddaughter will pass these tests, and she will have all the opportunities she deserves," the grandmother firmly stated. I don't care what her parents said. The director was trying to object to something, but "Mrs. Walker, we need parental consent." Grandma raised her hand, interrupting him, and answered with icy confidence, "I will deal with my son and his wife. You just make sure that Sunday gets her chance." After a week of fierce discussions, as well as I suspected, several secret offers of help from my grandparents, my parents finally gave their consent. I passed the entrance tests with flying colors, and suddenly the world around me opened up like a huge map of an unknown country. "Emma, this is cheating," I protested, seeing her hand me her sloppily written notes and unfinished lab assignments again. "Sunday, help your sister right now," my mother's voice would invariably sound, stern and demanding, leaving no room for objections. "The family helps the family," she added, thereby putting an end to any attempts by me to resist. In the end, I did the work for Emma, feeling like a fraud, afraid to raise my head, afraid to object. Over time, it became a kind of ritual. Emma demanded, my parents insisted, and I obediently obeyed. My voice was drowned in the invisible shackles of family obligations, and the echoes of protest were muffled, barely born. Sometimes, locked in my room, I would hear my parents talking about me. Their whispers went up the stairs, making their way to me through the cracks of the doors, while I bent over my chemistry set or absorbed in studying another scientific article. "I just don't understand where she got it from," Mom sighed. "No one in our family is like that." "Maybe it was planted for us," my father jokingly added, but there was a hint of something strange, almost serious in his voice, and this lightness with a hint of neglect hurt me. The words burned like tiny needles, leaving invisible wounds, and I tried not to think about what they meant. One evening, after I won another science competition, I overheard my father talking to Emma. They were sitting in the office, but the door was ajar, and their voices reached me. "It's not fair that she's so smart," Emma complained. There was an exasperated annoyance in her voice, as if the very fact of my existence belittled her own achievements. "Listen, dear," her father seemed to be trying to calm her down. His voice was full of gentleness and encouragement. "That's why we're focusing on you. Sunday, well, she's going to be fine." I froze outside the door, pressing my back against the cold wall, trying my best to hold back the tears. It was the same old explanation. It was as if my hard work and abilities somehow made me less in need of love, support, and care. At school, I was that weird girl who spent her lunch breaks not in the school cafeteria, but in the laboratory, surrounded by test tubes and flasks, researching formulas and reactions. Of course, I was often asked for help with homework, but true friendship remained something distant, almost ephemeral, like a star on the horizon that I was not destined to approach. My grandparents remained my only allies. They could listen to me talk for hours about the latest experiments and hypotheses, and not once did I have to feel strange in their company. Grandfather, smiling, sometimes took out of his bag some scientific journal or new equipment for my research. "Look what I found for you," he would say, as if offering a priceless treasure, and this phrase filled my heart with joy. And yet, despite their unconditional support, I felt a huge emptiness where parental love should have been. I noticed other children at school events, saw how their parents hugged them, proudly watching their successes, how brothers and sisters supported each other, sharing joy and excitement. This difference, sharp and painful, has always left a mark on my soul. Then, out of the blue, came the news that changed everything. I graduated from school 2 years earlier, at the age of 16. All the requirements were met, and I was offered a full scholarship to one of the best universities in the country. The day I left home, for the first time, I wanted to breathe deeply, as if the world had finally opened its arms to me. The university campus pulsed with energy like a boiling cauldron filled with many ideas and possibilities. This time I didn't feel out of place. In advanced chemistry classes, I met Sarah and Michael, people for whom molecular structures and chemical formulas were no less fascinating than for me. For the first time in my life, I had friends who understood me, to whom I did not seem strange. We spent hours in the laboratory discussing new ideas, developing hypotheses, making small but such significant discoveries. We were burning with this knowledge, and every new fact, every experiment brought us genuine joy. And yet, despite this success, there was an emptiness inside me. I called home every week, hoping that the conversations would be something more than the off-duty answers I usually heard. "Yes, Sunday, that's good," my mother would say when I tried to excitedly talk about the new results of my research, as if it were just a light interest that did not deserve her attention. "Have you heard about Emma's new job? She works in a fashion boutique in the city center." Her voice was animated, and pride was easily discernible behind her words. There was clearly no place for my scientific discoveries at the other end of the line. I didn't know then that my time at university was just a calm before the storm. It all happened during one of the usual calls home. I was in the middle of the second semester, immersed in a research project, when my mother's voice interrupted my thoughts. It sounded strange, detached, as if she was forgetting that I was listening. "And your father's condition has worsened," she said, apparently addressing someone nearby. My heart sank. "Mom, what's going on with Dad? And what about Grandpa?" I blurted out, barely able to contain my anxiety. There was a long, too long pause at the other end. "Oh, Sunday," I didn't know you were still here. Mom hesitated, her voice suddenly taking on a slightly worried tone. There is nothing serious, just a small health problem. He's already recovering. I'm going home, I said, already planning how to leave as soon as possible, but her response was sharp and abrupt. Don't you dare. You need to focus on your studies. Emma is helping us, everything is under control. Something in her tone resonated with an alarming falsehood, but I tried to convince myself that it was just paranoia. However, I was worried, and as soon as we hung up, I immediately called my grandmother. Oh, yes, dear, she replied, her voice somehow distant, as if her mind was wandering somewhere far away. Emma helps us a lot. She often comes to visit Grandpa. Emma? The same sister who always found grandparents terribly boring? Something clearly didn't add up. Anxiety did not leave me, and 2 weeks later I stood in front of the familiar front door of my grandparents' house, my heart pounding with anticipation. But instead of the warm welcome I used to expect, the door opened and Emma appeared in front of me, her face frozen in a mask of annoyed surprise. What are you doing here? She asked coldly, blocking my way. I came to visit my grandparents. How are they? I tried to get past her, but she cut me off with a sharp movement. No one's home, she replied, her words coming out too quickly, unconvincingly. They're gone. Where could they have gone? I persisted, not going to back down, but Emma just snorted. I don't know, Sunday, just go away, she said, and before I could take a step, she tried to close the door right in my face. I managed to put my foot in the doorway. Let me come in and wait for them, I insisted, but she pushed the door open, pressing hard on my leg. God, you're so annoying. Just go away. Confused and offended, I walked away from the door and desperately dialed my grandmother's number. But instead of the usual voice, there was only a voicemail on the other end. It wasn't like Grandma at all. She always kept her phone on, especially knowing that I could call. Breathless with excitement and disappointment, I went to my parents' house in the hope of getting at least some answers. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen, and their faces took on an expression of unfriendly surprise as soon as I appeared on the doorstep. Sunday, what are you doing here? My father didn't even try to hide the irritation in his voice. I came to visit my grandparents, but they are not at home. Emma wouldn't let me in, I explained, expecting the long, awaited explanations to begin now. Oh, dear, Mom interrupted, exchanging a quick glance with her father, her voice filled with strange gentleness. We were going to tell you that your grandparents are in a nursing home right now. The world around me seemed to sway and turn over, as if I was standing on the edge of a cliff. Why didn't anyone tell me? My voice was shaking with indignation and pain. It was a quick decision, my father said with almost casual coldness, his words sounding casual and calm. They needed specialized care. Which nursing home? I want to visit them, I desperately insisted, but Mom barely sighed. Her answer sounded like a final verdict. They're in quarantine now. Mom quickly replied that visitors were not allowed, and maybe next time I would be able to see my grandmother. In the end, I had no choice but to return to the university, but anxiety was nesting in my heart. I tried to get back into my lab work, but my thoughts kept returning to that day at home, to Emma's cold gaze, to my parents' too smooth explanations, like a scene from a bad dream that wouldn't let me go. The alarm bell rang on Tuesday morning, and my heart immediately began to pound unevenly. The vibration of my mother's number on the phone screen caused an icy premonition, a strange certainty that nothing good could be connected with this call. The fluorescent lights flooded the lab with cold white light as my heart sank into a booming restlessness. Sunday, Mom began, her voice sounding strangely flat, with a detachment I'd never heard before. Your grandfather passed away last night. The test tube I was holding in my hand slipped and shattered on the floor with a clear, ringing echo that reverberated off the empty walls of the laboratory like a shot. No, I whispered, barely aware of my own words. When will the funeral be? My voice was breaking into a whisper. Thursday, at 2 p.m., she replied with detached clarity, in an almost automatic tone, and ended the conversation without even saying goodbye. The words sounded strange, almost like a rehearsed monologue, and I found myself hearing nothing but an empty goodbye. I rushed out of the lab, leaving the fragments of the test tube on the floor, and, grabbing a ticket for the first flight, immediately went home. Throughout the flight, I tried to hold back tears. My heart was torn by the bitterness of loss, from pain and from the dull regret that I could not say goodbye to the man who was for me the embodiment of everything that the word home meant. When I got to the church at 1:30 p.m. on Thursday, there were no cars in the parking lot. A strange unease crept into my mind. I crossed the empty room with quick steps, my footsteps echoing in the silence, creating a feeling of something incredible. Inside the church, I saw the caretaker slowly mopping the floor without looking up. Walker's funeral? I asked, almost losing hope. He stopped, looking up from his work. The funeral has already passed. They were in the morning, at 10 o'clock. The world abruptly turned upside down. The breath was taken away from an invisible blow. I automatically grabbed onto the nearest bench, my legs buckled, and I barely managed not to fall. Pulling out my phone, I dialed my parents' number with difficulty. "Oh, Sunday," Mom replied with a slight irritation in her voice. "You must have got the time wrong. We've made it clear, 10 o'clock. "No," I gasped, my trembling hand clutching the phone. "You said 1400 hours." I wrote it down. "You said 1400 hours." My voice trembled with confusion and anger, but her tone remained impassive. "Where's Grandma? I want to talk to her." Dad suddenly intervened in the conversation, and his voice sounded with cold-blooded detachment. "Grandma is still in the nursing home, Sunday. And she doesn't want to see you now. She's upset that you didn't come to the funeral." A dull despair ran through me, but instead of returning to the university, I headed for my grandparents' house. This street seemed painfully familiar to me, as if step by step I was returning to a world where people who love me unconditionally are still alive. The old oak tree, their carefully tended garden, and the bluebells that my grandmother loved so much greeted me in their former form, but something still subtly changed. With trembling hands, I rang the doorbell, not expecting anyone to answer. But the door slowly opened, and a grandmother appeared on the threshold, the same grandmother who allegedly did not want to see me, who, as I was told, was in a nursing home. "Grandma," I whispered, approaching her with a desire to hug her, but she took a step back, and her gaze stopped me in place. Her face was hard and cold, as if she was looking at a stranger and not at her granddaughter. "And now you've decided to show up." Her voice was icy, without a trace of the warmth I'd been used to since childhood. "My whole childhood, Grandma." "What's happening?" "They told me you were in a nursing home." The words came out of my mouth as I tried to understand this strange and cruel deception. But Grandma just raised her hand. Her gesture was sharp, almost like a blow, which silenced me. "Your grandfather called you over and over again," she said, her voice sounding restrained, but I could feel the raging pain behind that restraint. "He was waiting for you on his deathbed, dreaming of saying goodbye to the little scientist who was so dear to him. But you..." Her voice cracked. "You didn't bother to answer his calls or visit him. How could you be so cruel, Sunday?" "Give me the number he called from," I barely breathed out, feeling how resentment and despair merge into one. "Please, Grandma, I need to understand." For a moment, her face softened, and, pulling away, she disappeared inside the house. When she returned, she handed me a small notebook. Her hands were shaking as she showed me the phone number written in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. I looked at the numbers, and a cold wave ran through my body. "That's not my number," I whispered. "I've had the same number since I started school." "Someone gave him a fake number." "A fake number?" Her face twitched, her stern features began to slowly spread out in uncertainty. "Your parents said that you changed the number when you went to university, that you wanted to distance yourself from us. They said you were ashamed of us, that we weren't sophisticated enough for you. They said you grew up and left us behind." The pieces of the puzzle began to come together in my head, and a terrible picture of betrayal opened up in front of me. With a heavy voice, I began to tell her how I came home during the holidays, how Emma met me at the door and wouldn't let me into the house, how my parents assured me that my grandparents had been sent to a nursing home. I saw her face turn pale at every word I said. "A nursing home? We've never—" She stopped, taking in what she'd heard. "Emma and your parents told us that you were too busy with your new university life, that you were ashamed of us." Her voice trembled, and I realized that my words had shaken her to the core. "They assured us that you just don't care about your family, about your grandfather. Grandma, they said that Grandpa's funeral would be at 1400 hours, but when I came to the church, it was already over. They said I was wrong, but I remember the time exactly. I would never confuse him, never." The words escaped my lips. I tried to restrain my emotions, but my voice trembled with anger and resentment. "The funeral was at 10 o'clock, Grandma said softly, as if repeating this truth to herself, realizing the depth of the deception. "Your parents stood there and told everyone how ashamed they were that you didn't even bother to come to your own grandfather's funeral. And Emma, she stood there crying, saying how she tried to get in touch with you. Everything in me is broken." I took a step towards my grandmother, and she hugged me to her, just like when I was little and hid from the world in her arms. Tears were streaming down my face. I couldn't stop. I felt the bitterness of loss spreading inside, filling every cell. "Grandpa died thinking that I abandoned him, that I didn't care," I sobbed, burying my face in her shoulder. Grandma stroked my hair, comforted me, as if I was that little girl again, with a broken knee, but now the pain was unbearably worse. We cried together, and in these tears dissolved all the pain that I had felt over the past months, all the disappointment and resentment that had accumulated, leaving unhealed wounds in my soul. Finally, we wiped away our tears, and Grandma picked up the phone with a determined expression on her face. "Linda." "It's me," she said firmly, her voice cold and ruthless again. "I need you. Bring Robert and Emma. They should be here in an hour. We have a lot to discuss." I watched her hang up the phone with a slight sigh. Her face remained serious, her gaze focused, but there was determination in her eyes. I told them that there are important documents that need to be discussed. "The lawyer will be here too," she added, looking at me. At that moment, she was like a commander going into battle for his honor, for his family. Soon the doorbell rang. Grandma squeezed my hand and nodded gently. "Stay in the kitchen, Sunday, until I call you." I heard them come in. The clatter of heels and muffled voices came from the hall, and I held my breath, waiting for the moment when I needed to appear. When the lawyer opened his briefcase, I went out into the living room, feeling the eyes on me, which showed confused surprise. Mom's smile froze on her face, turning into an unnatural grimace, and Dad's face lost color. Emma's mouth fell open in shock, and she seemed shocked to the core. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began to read the will. His voice sounded clear and weighty, every word cutting through the tense silence of the room. I, George Walker, being in my right mind, declare that this is my last will and testament. Everyone held their breath. The rustle of the pages under his fingers was the only sound, except for the loud but silent emotions that colored the faces of my parents and Emma. The first item was the will about the house. My grandfather left it to my grandmother along with an impressive amount for her care and maintenance. But then Mr. Harrison read to the point that caused a surge of emotion that filled the room with Emma's cold fury. To my granddaughter, Sunday Walker, I leave my newly built laboratory at 1420 Pine Street, fully equipped and ready for her research work. All necessary permits and documents have been processed and completed. I couldn't believe my ears. My grandfather built me a laboratory, fully equipped and ready to work. To me, his little scientist. My heart was filled with a mixture of pride and bitterness, the last reminder of his love for me. But before I could process it, Mr. Harrison continued, announcing that the rest of the estate, including significant financial assets, was divided equally between Emma and me. Emma's chair slid across the floor with a loud squeak as she jumped to her feet, but Grandma motioned for her to sit down. Her eyes were fixed on the lawyer as she handed him the sealed letter. "That's not all," she said. "There's another letter that Grandpa wanted me to read aloud." She began to read it in a clear, firm voice that sounded with special solemnity. "My dear family, I have watched over the years how favoritism has poisoned our family, undermining relationships and hurting those who deserve love. Your treatment of your daughters, Robert and Linda, was shameful. Every child deserves equal love and equal support, regardless of personal ambitions and interests." Emma jumped up, her voice piercing the silence like a knife. "That's enough. This is ridiculous. Why should she get anything? You know how much I had to sit with this boring old man, pretend that I care." Mom tried to calm her down by putting her hand on her shoulder, but Emma threw it away, as if she could no longer contain her irritation. "You promised," she said accusingly. "You said that if I visited him, if I behaved like a perfect granddaughter, everything would go to me. You made me sit next to a dying man pretending to be a caring granddaughter." The truth about the manipulation and cold calculation that prevailed in our family was revealed in all its frightening, searing ugliness. Emma's every word sounded shrill, like the cry of a wounded predator. "And now little Miss Perfect gets the whole lab, and I only have half the money left," she screamed, looking at her parents. "No, give me the house. I need him more than she does. She can take her damn lab." I silently looked at Emma, seeing her in her true light, when all the cool shades of her soul manifested in all its glory. The image of the ideal daughter, cherished by her parents, was bursting at the seams, exposing a cold, selfish nature that demanded its own at any cost. Mom looked at me, her face softened, as if she was about to say words of reconciliation. "Sandy," she began softly, "you heard what your sister was saying. Is it wise for you to give up what she needs more? Do you know how much we have invested in your education, in all these science camps and competitions? We've always made sacrifices for you." I couldn't help but grin. "You haven't paid for any of my courses or research trips." It was Grandma and Grandpa. But Mom wouldn't let me finish. "It doesn't matter," she said sharply, trying to get around the obvious. "Family is a sacrifice. If you really want to honor your grandfather's memory, you'll give your share to Emma. She needs it more than you do." "To honor his memory?" Grandma's voice was like a whip, cutting through the tense silence. Grandma stood up, holding Grandpa's letter like a shield, her gaze unwavering. "Let me remind you exactly what George said about your sacrifice." Her voice, strong and determined, filled the room. She picked up the letter again and, clearing her throat, began to read, "To my son and his wife. Your obvious favoritism has created poison in this family. Your treatment of Sunday was nothing short of emotional abuse, while you turned Emma into a spoiled and selfish one. How dare you? Emma jumped up, her voice trembling with indignation, but Grandma stopped her exclamation with one movement. No, how dare you? Her voice came out with a force I'd never heard before. All these years, you manipulated and lied, deceived a dying man, and did not allow his beloved granddaughter to say goodbye to him. And now you dare to talk about family and victims? Grandma came to the door, her movements full of cold dignity, and opened it wide. Go away. All of you, her voice burned the space between us. She looked at Emma, and there was more compassion in her gaze than condemnation. I'm sorry George left you anything at all, Emma. You're just a spoiled egoist who grew up on lies and manipulations that you picked up from your selfish parents. Grandma's words echoed through the room, and Emma and her parents left the house under a barrage of threats, angry glances, and slamming doors. As soon as they left, the house was plunged into silence, but this silence was warm, like a breathing, living peace that remained instead of a broken lie. That was 5 years ago. Today I am doing my own research in the laboratory that my grandfather built for me. The lab has become everything I've ever dreamed of, and even more. She was my refuge and a place where every discovery seemed like a meeting with the spirit of the person who believed in me the most. When I work late, sometimes it seems to me that I feel his presence. I can almost hear his calm voice, full of pride and love. Grandma often visits me, and every Sunday we have dinner together. She asks with sincere interest about my latest research and projects, from time to time conducting tours of the laboratory, as if plunging back into the world of discoveries that was so dear to my grandfather. Recently, she even started taking science classes at a local college, saying it helps her understand my research better. But I think she just wants to share that passion for science and discovery that my grandfather and I valued so much. I haven't talked to my parents or Emma since that day. Sometimes I see their names in the list of incoming emails or missed calls, but I don't open them anymore. They made their choice, and I made mine. Recently, while flipping through one of my grandfather's old books, I found a photo. In it, in his garden, he points to something that little me was looking at, curiously looking through a magnifying glass. On the back he wrote, "My little scientist will change the world someday." Now this photo is on my desk, a memory of a man who really knew me and believed in me. Not the whole family is connected by blood. I realize that a real family is those who support your dreams, who love you for who you are, who appreciate your differences, and do not condemn them. And for me, this family will always be the one who showed me the world of science and love.